There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. And I am here with a very special guest. I am here with the novelist Cauvery Madhavan, author of, among 3 novels that she has written. Her most recent is The Tainted, a 2020 novel that I just finished reading a few days ago. Warm welcome to my channel, Cauvery.
Thanks so much, Shawn. I'm just delighted to be talking to you all the way in Tokyo.
Tokyo to County Kildare, Ireland, right?
That's right, yeah. I came to Ireland, Shawn, as a 23-year-old, along with my husband, who was a junior doctor.
4 years ago, right?
23 years ago. No, 34 years ago, sorry. So, yeah, you're very kind. No, we came to Ireland. I came basically as an accompanying spouse. We ended up making our lives here. We love Ireland, and I think we made a good life for ourselves, both from a career point of view for both of us, and for family and friends and living point of view as well. It's our home now.
That's wonderful. Do you have a favorite piece of Irish slang or vocabulary?
Yeah, I think the all-encompassing, it's grand.
It's grand.
It's grand, yeah. It really literally covers everything that, it covers. It's grand, which means it's actually not grand.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, just grand, you sort of combine it with your facial expression or nod of a head or lifting of a chin, and it could just mean completely different things. So I love that word. It can be quite confusing for non-Irish people.
All purpose. Well, I mean it in the most enthusiastic way possible, that this novel was grand.
Fantastic.
And this novel is very much about Irish and Indian people and cultures. Would you like to just in a very general way kind of set it up? What is this novel about?
Yeah, sure, Shawn. So The Tainted is loosely based on the mutiny of the Connacht Rangers. The Connacht Rangers were a very, very well-known, famous regiment with a great history of valor and honor and bravery over a period of 150 to 300 years. And in 1920, as part of the British Empire, they were stationed in India. And it was at the same time, that there was a lot of unrest in Ireland. Ireland was fighting for her freedom. There was a group of people who were called the Black and Tans. They were basically like a rough militia. Well, they weren't actually militia. They were official British troops who were sent into Ireland to quell the unrest. And because of the terrible atrocities they committed, and when news of that filtered down to the soldiers who were in India, the Irish Catholic soldiers just decided that they'd had enough and they mutinied. And so my book is loosely based on the mutiny, but the actual story moves from the mutiny to the aftermath. And I tell a story of what happens to the progeny of soldiers who were left behind, mixed race children that were left behind.
And you weave all of the implications, consequences, and legacy of that in such a sophisticated way. I think it's very difficult to do, to show that through the lives of characters and to not make it kind of an info dump. There's nothing info dumpy about this novel. It's wonderful. And I have to say that I'm not a big reader of historical fiction. And I loved this novel, so.
Yeah, well, thank you, because I researched this book so heavily and so much that it actually put me on my guard, because I then felt, oh my God, I don't want to then dump all that research into the book. So I was really very, very careful at all times. And when I finished the research, I actually stopped. I didn't read anymore. I just wrote without referencing back unless I absolutely had to. I'm so glad that you felt it didn't, that all the research didn't sit heavily in the book.
No. Yeah, and it's because your characters were so vivid. So the first character we meet, I believe, is Private Michael Flaherty. Who is he?
Well, he's my young soldier. Just to sort of further explain it, Shawn, when I started writing the book, it was to be a true and faithful account of the mutiny and the aftermath, and what happened to those soldiers when they came back to Ireland, because they were quite badly treated when they came back to Ireland. And that was because the Irish population basically felt that they had taken the king's shilling and they'd served the crown. So they were quite badly treated. But when I actually started writing the book, I realized that there was actually a story beyond the mutiny, and that was a story of the mixed race children that a lot of soldiers left behind. And I also realized that in being true and faithful to the Connacht Rangers story, I was actually setting myself up for disaster, because when you're writing fiction about a regiment that actually existed, and with every regiment there's only one colonel, only one chaplain, one adjutant, I'm putting words into people's mouths who actually lived and who have descendants. So then I decided, okay, I will change the name of the regiment to the Kildare Rangers, because I live in County Kildare, and my soldier Michael Flaherty comes from Ardclough, the little townland that I live in at the moment. We've lived here for the last 20 years. So Michael Flaherty is my young soldier in the Kildare Rangers. And, the book opens with him, with his first weekend off in India.
One of the first people that he meets, not the very first, but is Father Jerome. And what should we know about him?
Again, when I was researching Irish regiments and just regiments, British regiments in India, I realized a huge role that chaplains, regimental chaplains play, particularly because most of the soldiers in Irish regiments that were part of the British Raj, most of the soldiers would have been Catholics, while the officers would have been Protestant. So the chaplains played a huge role. Apart from everything else, a lot of the soldiers were illiterate. They couldn't read or write, and the chaplains then became the conduit for reading and writing letters back home. So they knew their men's lives intimately and had a massive role to play.
And certainly Father Jerome plays a massive role in this story. Yeah, very good.
Yes.
Who are the Aylmers?
So the Aylmers, most Irish regiments would have had Anglo-Irish or English officers who would have been Protestant. Anglo-Irish Protestants or English Protestant officers. And the Aylmers, Colonel Aylmer is my fictitious colonel of the regiment, but the name Aylmer actually is very local to where I live. What we here in Ireland we call the Big House. One of the Big House families around Strafford would have been the Aylmers. But I felt I was free to use their name because there's so many branches, so nobody could actually even now pinpoint which one of them. I mean, it's not about any of them, but I just use the name because there are several of them, several branches of the family, and I knew I could get away with using that name. So anyway, Colonel Aylmer is the commanding officer of the regiment, and his wife is quite a stern, upright woman who doesn't want to embrace India. She tolerates India.
And so Michael gets connected to them. We won't explain everything. People need to go and read the book. But through that connection, he comes into contact and eventually gets romantically involved with Rose Twomey. Is that the right pronunciation?
Twomey. Very Irish name. Yeah.
And her father, the Baconwalas. So tell us about them.
So there were a lot of soldiers when the regiments came back. A lot of soldiers who were time expired, who had done their time, their 20 years or, their 50, whatever they had signed up for. A lot of soldiers actually stayed behind in India because, they had good lives in India that they wouldn't have had in Ireland. Or they certainly wouldn't have had the kind of life they'd had a chance to have in India. So Rose Twomey's father, the Baconwala, and he's called the Baconwala because he supplied the regiment with bacon and chicken. And, when he retired, that's the little business he set up for himself in India. And he lived, in comparative luxury to what he would have had. Well, not comparative, he lived in absolute luxury compared to his origins in Ireland. He came from a small village of Glengariff and basically came from poverty. And that's why he joined the regiment. Rose Twomey is his daughter. Shawn Twomey marries an Indian woman, a half-caste woman. And Rose is his beloved daughter. But things change and things pan out as the book goes on, and I won't say anything more.
Rose and Michael become a couple, and that is a very good business indeed. Yeah. I loved the vividness of the setting, and I mean geographically, culturally, and historically. Yeah. I just would love you to tell everybody about the Punkas.
Yeah, well, the Pankas were, the Pankas. So the Pankas are basically a cloth fan that's hung from the ceiling. It was a feature of British India before electricity, to have these Pankawalas who would sit outside. The word wala just means man, so it was the Panka man, Pankawala, who sat outside the room and pulled these cloth fans that were hung from the ceiling, just to keep the air cool and circulating. And they were a real feature, an absolute sort of every home would have had them. lives were made livable in India because of the Pankawalas.
You show very clearly that the Pankawalas are the bottom of the.
Absolute bottom. Yeah, yeah.
They're standing outside in the heat to keep the
Mm,
richer upper class people cool, and they're
yeah, yeah.
that was so vivid that I could feel the air wafting down on me as I read. It was just and so much like that I felt like I could touch, taste, see. Very descriptive in terms of the history. I didn't know anything about India in the 1920s, and I felt like I was there. So that was fabulous. So you've
Thank you.
talked about the historical basis.
Mm.
What I was curious about going into this novel, knowing only that it was about an Irish mutiny in Ireland, connected to the time of troubles back home, that there was kind of a double colonialism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That you explored in such a fascinating way. So I'd like you to talk a bit about the Anglo-Irish and the Anglo-Indians and sort of connections and discrepancies.
The title of the book, The Tainted, really deals with the three groups of people in the book. One was the Anglo-Indians, who are mixed race, people of mixed race. They were fathered by soldiers, civil servants, traders, merchants of the British Raj, mainly Irish, Scot, Welsh, and English. Because of their mixed race, they weren't accepted by their father's people, and they were certainly not accepted in India. So, they were tainted by their birth, really, by their blood. Then the Anglo-Irish people are the descendants of the conquering English in Ireland. And until very recently, Anglo-Irish people also had a very strange, paradoxical living in Ireland, because they were never Irish enough in the Irish people's eyes, and obviously never English enough for the English. So they were also, they are also till very recently a group in limbo. And then you have the Irish Catholic soldiers, also tainted by the fact that they served the crown while their own country was under colonial rule. So, it's a very paradoxical situation for the three groups. And that's why I thought when we picked the name and I chose the name The Tainted, it literally described the people in the book, tainted by association and birth.
So all of those historical forces created the perfect storm for this story. All of that gave birth to these characters in this situation, and you have explored it so beautifully. Another powerful strand of the story that I felt so viscerally as I was reading it, connected to what we were just talking about, and that's the racism. I expect when I read a book set in 1920 in pretty much any country to be full of racism, but there was something extraordinarily visceral about how you showed these characters being affected by it, perpetrating it on others, and that there was just levels almost like mirror upon mirror of oppression. I'd love to hear you talk a bit about that as well.
As I was saying to you earlier on, Shawn, I set out to write a book about the mutiny, but as I started looking more and more into it, I started reading letters that soldiers were writing back. A lot of the military chaplains would have written and kept extensive diaries. I came across such obvious racism, looking at it now, but in those days it was just par for the course. It wasn't even, people wouldn't have even blinked. Even a man who I admire, I know he's a fictitious character, but Colonel Aylmer, who I really admire, but even his attitude towards the Catholic soldiers, towards the men in his regiment, would have been quite patriarchal, but at a distance. His treatment of Indians would have been, very offhanded. And yet, this was a man who loved India. I think a lot of people loved India for the life that it gave them rather than for the people in those days, because they had such a good life. And as you can imagine, later on in the book, when Colonel Aylmer's grandson describes his grandparents in later years to have to come back to Ireland and to live a very ordinary life, suddenly when you came from being the king of the garrison town. So I think a lot of the love for India that the old India hands, as they call them, had, was really to do with the lifestyle that they had rather than the people.
And you show, again, very viscerally how for certain of the characters, that the expatriation afforded them an opportunity to, if not self-invent a new identity, but to oppression back home based on being Anglo-Irish or being of a different religion or whatever. And then to be in a new place and then perpetrate things that...
It's very hard to come to terms with how Irish soldiers treated Indians in India in 1920 when you compare it to how much Ireland supported India's bid for freedom almost at the same time. You know, politicians in Ireland were clamoring. As soon as Ireland got her freedom, one of the first things after Ireland got freedom was to clamor for Indian freedom. So it's a very strange thing. That's typical Irish paradox, I think. The sort of the push and pull of one and the other.
If not a post-colonial paradox. I was trying to put off using that big word in this interview, colonial. And then you explore the ramifications of all of that in successive generations in the second part. We don't want to give away too much. We want everybody to go out and pick up your fabulous novel, but tell us a bit about the second half of the novel, which is set in 1982.
80s, yeah. So in the 80s, Colonel Aylmer's grandson goes back to that garrison town in India because the family has discovered a whole sheaf of watercolor paintings that his grandfather had painted. And Richard Aylmer, the grandson, is a photographer, and he has this idea and gets a commission to photograph the very same scenes that his grandfather had painted in the 20s. He's going to photograph those same scenes in the 80s. So he goes back on a research mission, really, to see if it's even possible. What happens in the story is that he meets the grandchildren of Shawn Toomey and Rose Toomey, and then the story pans out then.
That's a good tease. Yeah. And without even the slightest bit of spoiler, I just have to say, what an incredibly powerful ending. Oh my God, I was just devastated.
Well,
that's my little tease for people.
Yeah. I think most people have loved the ending, so I'm glad you did too, Shawn.
So that's a good place to stop. So I want to thank you very much, Cauvery, for coming onto my channel. And I'm so happy to do all I can to promote your novel because I think it's a must read for 2020.
Oh, Shawn, I'm only just delighted to be talking to you. Thank you.
And a little tease of a different variety for my subscribers. Stay tuned. A week or two after you're watching this video, I will be posting a general bookish chat with Cauvery Madhavan. So stay tuned for that.
Fantastic.
In the meantime, thank you very much, Cauvery.
Thanks, Shawn. Thank you.